Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 230. Pretty Dulcie. Part 2. So she just got through the death of Taplin and then she became involved with Guido Coletti, another notorious Sydney gunman. He was the husband of Nellie Cameron, another prominent Sydney sex worker of that period. Coletti was shot dead in August 1939 in Sydney at a party that he attended with Dulcie. Reportedly, Dulcie was grief-stricken at his funeral. There was a coroner's inquest into the death of Guido Coletti on the 21st of September 1939. Dulcie identified herself as Mary Eugene and said she had been Coletti's de facto of over 2 years. Her failure to appear resulted in a warrant being issued for her apprehension. It's on the 3rd of November 1939 in the Lithgow Mercury. When Mary Eugene, 24, domestic, appeared at the Central Police Court on Monday of 6 charges of theft at Lithgow, the police prosecutor told Mr. Reid that a warrant had been issued from the coroner's court for the appearance of Eugene as a witness in an inquest. That apparently explains why Eugene was at Lithgow, he said. Detective Kelman said that after Eugene returned to Sydney from Lithgow, he questioned her about some goods that had been stolen from a room in a hotel at Lithgow. She admitted to have stolen the goods. Kelman said that a party of people at the hotel at Lithgow attended a wedding. When they returned from the wedding, they found their room had been ransacked. Mr. Reid, consolidating the 6 charges of theft into one, sentenced Eugene to a month's imprisonment on 2 other charges of having been drunk and having used indecent language, both of which offences were committed at the time of her arrest. Eugene was fined £2 and £3 respectively. By 1940, the 24-year-old, prettiest and most notorious woman in the Australian underworld, was romantically involved with 26-year-old Fred Eric James Anderson, known as Paddles, and she was planning on divorcing Bowen to marry him. But on the 20th of March 1940, her first husband, Frank Bowen, was shot and killed in King's Cross. On the 15th of August 1940, in Fitzroy, Dulcie, as Mary Eugene, was charged with vagrancy and no means of support. Dulcie claimed in court that they simply shared the same house and that Paddles Anderson gave her a weekly allowance as upkeep. The appeal was successful. On the 21st of July 1940 in the Sydney Daily Telegraph, Hoodoo Girls, 3 lovers killed. In Melbourne, Mrs. Dulcie Bowen of Fitzroy cried "Goodbye, sweetheart," and swore at the coroner this week when he committed Fred Eric James Paddles Anderson, 26, for trial on a murder charge, and she had good cause to be distressed. Anderson is Dulcie's 4th lover. The other 3 have died violently, 1 stabbed and 2 shot. But Anderson, Dulcie says, is the man she really loves, and when he is free she'll seek a divorce so she can marry him. At present is in Pentridge Jail awaiting trial on the charges of having shot John Charles Abrahams, 29, outside a Collingwood gambling house on the 15th of June. Better known in Sydney as Mary Eugene, Dulcie is the prettiest and most notorious woman in the Australian underworld. She's slender, grey-eyed, 24 and a platinum blonde until a few days ago when she changed to brunette. She's won beauty contests in New South Wales and Queensland. Today she said, "Because men who have loved me have died, I've been called the Hoodoo Girl. I've been sketched in the newspapers, feet apart, hair flying loose and holding a smoking gun. I'm no gun girl, I've never handled a gun. It's just unfortunate that I should have been associated with these particular men who have died. At heart, I'm just an ordinary girl. These things have been thrust upon me. I left home when I was 16. I was pert, more than ordinarily pretty, and fellows took a lot more notice of me, so I went out for a good time. When I was 21, I married Frank Bowen. Frank and I are still friends, but we don't live together anymore." Dulcie said that 8 years ago, a man named Scotty McCormack became her lover and he was stabbed to death in William Street, Sydney. Next, she met Arthur Kingsley Taplin, 23, and became his mistress. Taplin was shot in the stomach at the Cosmopolitan Hotel in Swanston Street, Melbourne, and died 6 days later. A man was charged with his murder but acquitted. For 2 years after that, Dulcie went under the name of Mary Eugene and was notorious Sydney gunman Guido Coletti's girl. Dulcie saw Guido shot dead in a fight in a house in Brougham Street, Darlinghurst, on the 6th of August 1939.
Said Dulcie, he was a swell guy. I went to his funeral and then went into smoke. I've known Paddles Anderson for as long as I can remember. They call him Paddles because of his big feet. We knocked about for a while and then we fell for each other good and proper. We came to Melbourne to get away from it all and took a cottage in a quiet suburban street. Everything went well until the other day when he was arrested. When this is over, I'm going to divorce my husband and marry Paddles. Dulcie is not permitted to visit Anderson at the jail because she's got convictions recorded against her, so each day she takes some friend to the jail and waits outside. The friend sees Anderson in visiting hours and takes messages to him from Dulcie. Dulcie buys all of Anderson's meals and has them sent to him. She is obtaining money to brief counsel to appear for Paddles at the trial. Then it seems that Dulcie may have had a daughter in 1942. The clue to that was in a South Australian newspaper, The Mail, on the 26th of April 1952 that says Dulcie, that every time like this happens, she has to take her 10-year-old daughter away from the school that she was attending and send her to another one. I have tried in vain to locate the identity of her daughter and so far I've been unsuccessful. On the 5th of December 1942, she's in Melbourne, and as Mary Eugene's, she's fined £20 for keeping a house of ill fame. In 1943, Dulcie relocated to the Queensland's Gold Coast at New Farm to take advantage of the influx of American GIs. When picked up for vagrancy by local police, she protested that she lived with her current de facto husband, taxi driver, James Arthur Williams, and that while he gave her money and groceries, she was not involved in the local sex industry at that time and was not aware of Williams's involvement in the sly grog or bootleg alcohol distribution networks that flouted wartime beer and spirits rationing mandates. Dulcie claimed in court she'd lived with the taxi driver and sly grog seller Williams for about 6 years, firstly in Melbourne and then in Brisbane. She also used the aliases or pseudonyms Tosca de Marquise and Tosca de Marine during this period. Dulcie spent much of her time evading the authorities, not only using her aliases, but hair dyes and flitting between cities, or as she herself remarks, she just went into smoke, although not always successfully. By this time, she'd clocked up almost 100 convictions across 4 cities, and she'd become one of the most famous criminals to walk through Australia's courtrooms. On the 9th of January 1944 in the Sydney Truth, Girl's Amazing Life in the Underworld. Behind the baby blue eyes of as dazzling a platinum blonde as ever trod trimly into the witness box at Brisbane Police Court in recent years lies a grim record of tragedy, crime and violent passion that would almost baffle the imagination of even the writers of the goriest blood and thunder literature. Tall, curvaceous, slim-ankled and creamy-complexioned Dulcie Williams, a 29-year-old glamour girl of the demi-monde, attractive even to a husky voice, revealed in court last week, rather unwittingly, an amazing association with the underworld that has had within its gamut gangster killings, stabbings and other sordid crimes. The innocent and disarming-faced Dulcie Williams is actually Mary Bowen, widow of Sydney gunman Frank Bowen, who met a sticky end at King's Cross in 1940, and she's had a closer view of violent life and violent death than probably any other living woman in Australia. Though it had to be dragged from her carmined lips by a relentless document-fortified prosecutor, Dulcie admitted her record and her association with gunmen and gangsters, but spat back some denials and left the court emotionally untrammelled, freed of a vagrancy charge that the police could not sustain in satisfaction of the court. It was stated that Dulcie, after previously being warned to get legitimate work, an injunction which she had allegedly scorned with the retort, "There are ways of getting money without working for it, and what does it matter so long as you get the money?" She was arrested on a vagrancy charge on the 7th of December. Dulcie's defence was that she was living with James Arthur Williams, an ex-Melbourne taxi driver, coupled with a denial that she told the police that Williams was a sly grog seller and that was an easy way to get money. She also vehemently denied that though she had been convicted of keeping houses of ill fame and had earned money herself this way, she had ever kept Williams, and when she came from Melbourne with him about 6 months ago, she had promised Williams to give up prostitution. At no time in Queensland, Dulcie added, had she been living on money unlawfully supplied by Williams. Mr. Green said, "Did Williams ever tell you that any money had been given to you or had been obtained from sly grog selling?" She said, "No, never." On the day she was arrested, continued Williams, she had £30 on her. This was part of money she'd saved from housekeeping and what Williams had given her. She added that she sold a fur coat for £49 as she did not require it in Queensland. She added that she'd been living with Williams for about 6 years. In March 1940, they had a disagreement and did not live together but occasionally met. The prosecutor asked, "What is your correct name?" She said, "Mary Eugene." "Weren't you lawfully married to Frank Bowen, who was murdered?" "Yes, Bowen is my married name." "You are also known as Dulcie Marco and Dorothy Taplin?" She said, "Those are aliases." "Wasn't it because you were living with these criminals that you took those names on?" "No." "You knew Arthur Kingsley Taplin and he was murdered at the time you were living with him?" "I was not there when he was killed. I was in Western Australia." The defendant also admitted she knew Guido Coletti and was present in the same house with 12 other people when he was shot dead on the 6th of August 1939. She was not living with Coletti at the time, but had been away from him. The defendant further stated that she also knew Cecil William McCormack, who was killed in a stabbing affray in Sydney, but she was only 15 then. The prosecutor asked, "Do you know Paddles Anderson, and were you living with him in 1940 when he was charged with murder?" She said, "I was not living with him, but I was in the same place, in Fitzroy Street, Fitzroy. Williams was at Richmond at the time." In further reply to the prosecutor, Dulcie said she was also known as Tosca de Marquise and Tosca de Marine, and admitted that she had a whole host of convictions. On her evidence, Mr. Stanley Wilson SM discharged her. In April 1940, she said she was committed for trial at Paddington on a charge of assault, occasioning actual bodily harm, and had absconded her bail. A warrant was still out for her arrest. On the 22nd of January 1944, in the Perth Mirror. Perth knew lovely blonde whose husband and lovers were murdered. Widow of a murdered gunman, girlfriend of 2 other men who were murdered, and a 4th who met a violent death. Beautiful platinum Dulcie Williams, with the innocent face and baby blue eyes, is well known in Perth. She was here with one of her lovers, who was murdered over in the east. Her past is set against a colourful background, with the underworld lid off, and she's still only 27. Onto the intriguing beauty with the ravishing figure, police in Brisbane have just tried unsuccessfully to pin a vagrancy charge. Husky-toned and self-possessed, Dulcie Williams has a string of aliases. Police allege that Dulcie was not earning a legitimate living when they arrested her. She admitted that she'd been convicted for keeping houses of ill fame, but insisted that she had reformed since living with Williams. And on the 6th of February 1944 in Brisbane, she was described as Dulcie Bowen, wife of Frank Bowen, and the mother of a child. She was accused of stealing a £40 diamond ring from brothel owner Nancy Wiley, where she once resided. She was still with James Williams at this time. The relationship with Williams ended in July 1945 when Williams received an 18-month sentence for receiving stolen ration cards, and he blamed Dulcie for his lapse into crime. So on the 15th of July 1945 in the Sydney Truth, notorious woman of underworld blamed for man's downfall, decline and a fall of a married man from the path of fidelity and honesty because of his association with the allegedly sinister and notorious woman of Sydney's underworld, known as Pretty Dulcie, was described to Judge Holt at the Court of Sessions last week. James Arthur Williams, 40, formerly of Collaroy, at present serving a sentence for consorting, pled not guilty to breaking, entering and stealing 3,197 food ration books and 1,548 clothing ration cards from a Commonwealth distributing centre at Mossman on the 5th of June 1944. The Crown prosecutor said 2 men, named Whitney Gower and Ogden, had been convicted of breaking into the Mossman Ration Centre and stealing the cards. About 100 of the cards were found in Williams' possession in a bungalow at Collaroy. Williams, in a statement from the dock, protested that he knew nothing of the robbery or the cards. He was supported by Whitney Gower, who came from jail to say Williams had nothing to do with either the crime or the ration books. Gower said he rented the bungalow at Collaroy for use as a baccarat school. Following Williams' conviction, the jail recorder informed the judge that in 1944 Williams had suddenly lapsed into crime and had incurred a number of convictions. Detective Sergeant Aldridge explained that his sudden lapse was due to Williams, a married man, becoming associated with a notorious woman named Mary Eugene. At the time of the ration book robbery, Williams was living with Eugene in a bungalow rented at Collaroy by Gower. Pleading for leniency, Mr. Goran said Williams became associated with a woman named Mary Eugene, who I'm informed is a notorious member of the underworld and of the criminal classes and has been the cause of numerous gun bouts. She is known as a gun mole and Pretty Dulcie. A number of men have been associated with her. It was immediately prior to his lapse into crime that Williams became associated with her. He went to Brisbane with her and landed himself in trouble. He has a wife living in Melbourne, and it was largely due to his association with Pretty Dulcie, who was found in the house where the dockets were found, that he's landed himself into trouble. He has definitely broken association with this woman. On one occasion, he absconded from bail on a charge at Newcastle and went to Melbourne, where his wife was very ill. He returned to face his trial and explained his absence. I will admit that it is no real excuse for a man that he fell from the wayside because of a woman, but I submit that this woman has been responsible for the fall of several men in the past and for several violent deaths amongst members in the underworld. Williams comes from a good family. James Williams died in Queensland in 1945. In September 1945, her next boyfriend, a leading Melbourne criminal, Leslie Walkerton, was shot dead in Richmond, Victoria. On the 28th of November 1945 in the Sydney Daily Mirror, gun girl jailed. Mary Eugene, 28, described by Detective Fisher at the Central Court today as being known as a gun mole who carried a gun for criminal associates when the latter were engaged in their crimes, was sentenced by Mr Hardwick to 6 months jail on a charge of habitually consorting with reputed criminals. Fisher arrested Eugene at 11:25pm on the 13th of November when she was with Stanley Keith Birch, a gunman, Marie Harding and Graham Miles Thompson at a cafe in Victoria Street, King's Cross. Later, before Mr Farrington, Eugene said Thompson and Lawrence McEwen, 27, labourer, were charged with having assaulted a taxi driver, Alfred Joseph Burke, at 1am on the 25th of October. McEwen failed to appear and his bail was forfeited. Mr Farrington sentenced Eugene and Thompson each to 1 month's jail and ordered each to pay a £5 compensation to the taxi driver. On the 26th of June 1946, she was in Perth as Diane Lee Bowen, and Dulcie was charged along with 2 other women with keeping a brothel. They were fined £5 with £2 6 shillings costs. She assured the courts she would immediately leave Western Australia. Her sister, Millicent Burrows, was also charged. On the 11th of August 1947 in Melbourne, aged 30, Dulcie was accused and stood trial for conspiracy to murder Velma Hull, the wife of Keith Kitchener-Hull, who had shot and killed another Sydney gangland figure, Donald the Duck Day, in January 1945. Dulcie and Edwin Martin, her current liaison, had visited a boarding house owned by Mrs Hull and demanded to see her. Charges were later dropped when another pair of local gunmen, Charles Martin and George Barrett, were charged with an attack on Hull, but was also acquitted a month later. Donald the Duck Day was a former jockey turned crime boss. He took a dislike to Hull and he and others dished out a beating to Hull, who was in the company of Day's wife at a house in Surrey Hills. Not satisfied with dishing out a beating, the Duck returned the next day, seemingly intent on doing more permanent damage to Hull, who he'd seen at a nightclub with Day's wife. He said, "It's on," and aimed a revolver at me, Hull would later say in court. It made a clicking sound but did not go off. I did not give him another chance. Hull shot Day in the cheek, heart and stomach, leaving the underworld figure dead in a pool of blood. Keith Kitchener-Hull was charged with murder but was cleared on the grounds of self-defence. If he thought that was going to be the end of the matter, he was mistaken. Donald Day had been providing protection for Dulcie and was also said to be romantically involved with her. 2 years after Donald Day was shot dead, Dulcie was living in Melbourne with an associate of George Barrett's, Charles Martin. Barrett had also moved back to Melbourne and so had Keith Kitchener-Hull, probably assuming he'd have an easier time of it if he moved away from the city where he'd put 3 bullets into a crime boss. Unfortunately for Hull, he kept crossing paths with Barrett and Markham in Melbourne, and neither of them were ready to forgive and forget. Hull would tell police he'd spoken to Barrett in Melbourne to make sure that there were no hard feelings over the death of Day, but Barrett brushed him off. Hull reported Barrett as saying, "I don't want to talk to you. When I see you, I'll see you." In late July 1947, Barrett and Charles Martin went to see Hull on what Barrett's lawyer described as a friendly social visit, but what Hull read as something a little more sinister. After a few drinks, all 3 men hopped into Hull's truck and went for a drive in St Kilda, pulling over in Neptune Street. At this point, Hull claimed Barrett pulled out a revolver and said, "Cop this," in true 1940s gangster style, before shooting him in the chest and hip. Hull survived, but initially refused to tell police who shot him. Keith Kitchener-Hull testified it was threats against his pregnant wife that prompted him to come forward and tell the police who shot him. The statement is in the Public Records Office of Victoria and it says, "My wife is in the family way and I consider the tactics of these people standing over a woman is despicable. and not the same as standing over a man, and this is the reason I am giving evidence, so my wife will be protected. I am not worrying about myself in this matter, nor am I considering myself." And that was written down by Detective Donnelly at the St Kilda Police Station on the 8th of August 1947. 4 days after Keith Kitchener Hull was shot, Dulcie and an accomplice made a visit to Hull's wife and allegedly threatened her. They were both charged with conspiring to kill. On the 9th of August 1947 in the Perth Daily News, Angel of Death charged. At the City Watch House today, a woman known to police as the Angel of Death was charged with conspiracy to murder the wife of Keith Kitchener Hull, 30, of St Kilda, on whose life an attempt was made in St Kilda on the 27th of July. The woman, a domestic Dulcie Markham, 30, of St Kilda, was charged with conspiracy to murder Mrs Velma Edith Hull at St Kilda on the 31st of July. The arrest followed a police search and the woman's arrival at the Russell Street headquarters today. Dulcie Markham of Faulkner Street, St Kilda, is a slim, blue-eyed blonde. She was released on £300 bail when she was remanded in the City Court today on a charge of conspiring to murder Velma Hull, but the charges were later dropped. A few weeks later, Dulcie again paid a visit to Hull's house in the company of 2 men and allegedly beat up the recovering Hull, striking him in the face with the butt of a pistol. A year later, on the 7th of August 1948, in the Sydney Smith's Weekly, Death Walks with the Black Widow, grim saga of Australia's underworld. This is a story of a beautiful woman known to the Australian police as Marie Eugene. Marie Eugene's history should convince some of these foolish, rather abandoned adolescents that crime doesn't pay. Marie Eugene, now only 33, is known by many names and titles. The commonplace and colourful name she devised herself. First, she was no worse than a delinquent girl chasing excitement. Her parents were decent folk, so decent that police have protected their good name by never charging Marie Eugene under her correct name. At 15, she made her debut in Sydney's underworld. She was tall and slim with blonde curls, a perfect complexion and baby blue eyes. Ace gunmen and petty thieves were attracted to her. That year, Cecil Scotty McCormack, a 21-year-old thug and gunman who'd graduated from the apprenticeship of juvenile delinquency, was discharged from prison. Marie threw in her lot with him and they planned to marry. But McCormack had an argument with a man in a shop doorway one night and was stabbed through the heart with a stiletto-like instrument. Marie Eugene was sitting in a picture theatre and a girlfriend rushed to break the news to her. She went to the morgue, identified the gunman's body and disappeared. Police arrested Alfred John Dillon, at whose home Marie had been living before she joined McCormack. Their theory was that Dillon had been in love with Marie Eugene. Marie was finally traced, according to detectives, disguised in a black wig. Her beauty and bearing in court proved a sensation. She had really arrived as an underworld personality. Alfred Dillon was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 13 years imprisonment. McCormack was given an expensive gangster funeral with all the trimmings of an elaborate coffin and pyramids of flowers. Marie went to Melbourne and associated herself with Arthur Kingsley Taplin. Taplin was shot down at the Cosmopolitan Hotel in December 1937. Returning to Sydney, Marie caught the eye of Guido Coletti, a one-time notorious boy delinquent, reformatory graduate, petty larcenist and gunman. Coletti was shrewd. Although the police knew plenty about him, they could never sheet home a serious charge. The longest sentence he ever served was 2 years. Following his regular technique, he lured a man into a lane to maul and rob him. The intended victim thrashed Coletti, then frog-marched him to the nearest police station, where he laid the charge that resulted in a 2-year sentence. Coletti became uncrowned king of Sydney's underworld and Marie became his queen. In 1939, a party was held at a Darlinghurst boarding house. Coletti and Marie were there, a fight started, bottles and furniture were smashed, and Coletti fell dead when guns were drawn. Coletti was given the most spectacular gangster funeral in Australian history. More than 5,000 people filed past his coffin in the mortuary, and more than 200 wreaths were sent. While Coletti's body was lying in a Sydney funeral parlour, Marie Eugene made a dramatic entrance to weep over the dead gunman. She then vanished and police looked for her as a witness and could not find her until the murder trial was almost ended. At some stage of her career, no one seems to know just when, she married a Sydney gunman named Frank Bowen. Bowen was shot to death in King's Cross in 1940. In that same year, Marie was associated with Paddles Anderson in Melbourne. Anderson was a man who stood trial for murder and was acquitted. At 33, Marie Eugene's past is a lurid, terrifying story. And her future? She may have realised by now that society hasn't much mercy for those who violently break its laws. On the 3rd of October 1950 in Melbourne, Charles H. Mills, 26, of South Melbourne, was sentenced to 6 months imprisonment. George Collins, 50, of Fawkner Street, St Kilda, to 3 months, and Dulcie Markham, same address, to 1 month in prison, all charged with stealing. On the 8th of May 1951 in St Kilda, Dulcie Markham, 35, Millicent, 28, her sister, and a man described by Dulcie as her brother, George Collins, 46, were charged with having stolen 4 rolls of material and other goods from a van in the city on the 4th of May. There has been no evidence found that George was Dulcie's relative. On the 13th of July 1951 in the Melbourne Argus, police find goods in a floor cache. A detective told the City Court yesterday that he found more than £40 worth of allegedly stolen goods under hinged floorboards in a St Kilda house on the 8th of May. Dulcie Markham, 35, her sister Millicent, 28, and brother George Collins, 46, all of Fawkner Street, St Kilda, were charged with having stolen 4 rolls of material and other goods. Detective Stafford said the hinged boards were covered by carpet and a wardrobe. The sisters and Collins denied they knew the trapdoor was there. Mr McLean summed up, there is no evidence of actual possession against any of the accused, and the case is dismissed. On the 7th of July 1951 at the Methodist Parsonage in St Kilda, she was a witness at her sister Millicent's wedding, and she signed the wedding register as Dulcie Penny Markham. On the 25th of September 1951, Dulcie was shot in the hip at a wild party that turned violent in St Kilda. Her then boyfriend and ex-boxer, Gavin Thomas Walsh, was shot and killed at the same party. Ernest Alfred James Martin was accused of the shooting but later acquitted. On the 21st of November 1951 in the Brisbane Telegraph, Dulcie Markham denies 2 men did shooting. A woman who was shot at a St Kilda house on the 25th of September today denied that either of the 2 men in court was the one who shot her. The woman, Dulcie Markham, gave her evidence in the criminal court from a stretcher. Alfred Martin, 30, a Collingwood stevedore, and Charles Mills, 29, of St Kilda, have pled not guilty to a charge of having murdered ex-boxer Gavin Walsh, 23, of East Malvern. Gavin Walsh died at the Alfred Hospital early in the morning of September the 26th, following a shooting in a house in Fawkner Street. Dulcie Markham had her hip shattered by a bullet, and Desmond Walsh, 25, of St Kilda, brother of Gavin Walsh, was shot in the hand. Earlier in the evening, evidence was given that Desmond Walsh identified Martin and Mills as the 2 men who fired the shots. This morning, Markham, a blonde, gave her occupation as a domestic. She told Mr Monaghan that she was at her home on the evening of September the 25th. She was in the front bedroom and Gavin and Desmond Walsh were with her. About the time she was shot, she was lying on the bed and 2 men came to the bedroom door. One had a revolver in his hand and began firing. She saw the man and she had never seen him before in her life. She knew Ernest Martin very well and he was not the man who shot her. Markham also denied that Mills was one of the 2 men who came into the house at the time she was shot. Mills, she said, had been at her place earlier that evening. She was asked at the time he was at your place, was there any argument or trouble at all? She said, oh no. Markham said it was not long after Mills left that the 2 men came into the bedroom. She got a very good look at them. There was no firing before they got into the bedroom. Desmond Walsh was standing near the dressing table. When the men walked in, they did not seem to notice anyone else and they started firing towards Desmond. I heard some screaming and running of footsteps down the passage, females, and the next thing I was shot, says Markham. 3 months later, on the 8th of December 1951, while still recovering from the shooting, she married Leonard David Lewis, known as Redder, in St Kilda. Leonard David Lewis was listed as a bachelor and Dulcie Penny Markham as a spinster. No children were listed. They separated within 12 months and were later divorced. Redder Lewis was shot in Melbourne on the 22nd of April 1952. He survived but died in Melbourne in September 1965. On the 26th of April 1952 in the Adelaide Mail. In Sydney, in her home at Surrey Hills where the reporters found her, pretty Dulcie Markham said, I've had enough, I don't want to be involved in any more shootings. The curse that surrounds pretty Dulcie Markham has struck again. In Melbourne on Wednesday, pretty Dulcie's latest husband, Leonard Redder Lewis, was shot in the stomach by an unknown gunman. Lewis married pretty Dulcie in Melbourne late last year, shortly after she'd been wounded in a shooting brawl at her St Kilda home. In that brawl, one of her associates, Desmond Walsh, was also wounded and his brother Gavin Walsh killed. Walsh was the 5th man in pretty Dulcie's life to die violently. Lewis would have been the 6th, but the underworld plan to kill Redder while he was visiting Melbourne from Sydney misfired, and is now recovering in hospital. Said pretty Dulcie, I've no idea why they shot Redder. I have no men friends who could be jealous of Retta, and I don't know any woman who might be jealous of our marriage. Retta merely went to Melbourne to finish some business. Mrs. Lewis wanted to go to Melbourne to see her husband in hospital, but her doctor would not let her go. She's still receiving treatment for her hip, which was hit by a bullet during the Walsh shooting affray at St Kilda. Now over 40, Mrs. Lewis gained the name of Pretty Dulcie from her younger days when she was strikingly beautiful, tall, slim and naturally blonde with a peaches and cream complexion. On the 24th of February 1952 in St Kilda, Dulcie was seriously injured in her home. She was admitted to the Alfred Hospital with a lacerated scalp, a possible fractured thigh and a black eye. She did not wish the police to take any action, and she would not tell who caused her injuries. In 1952, she served 6 months in Long Bay Jail for an outstanding warrant issued in 1946 when she was convicted of consorting. On her release, she paid tribute to prison surgeons who had patched up her hip so that she could walk again unaided. On the 26th of November 1952 in the Sydney Morning Herald, claiming to be Mary Eugene, Dulcie is charged with consorting with reputed criminals Stuart Davis and Elizabeth Lee. She was identified by the defence lawyer as the wife of Leonard Lewis. Mary Eugene, 38, who was charged at the Central Court today with consorting with men, one of whom, according to her solicitor, was her husband, was sentenced to 7 days jail. The charge was that she had consorted with reputed criminals between the 11th of September and 13th of October this year, that on the 13th of October, Detective Brooks saw Eugene with a reputed criminal named Leonard Lewis and with Stuart Davis and Elizabeth Lee, also known to the police as reputed criminals. Mr. Phil Roach, who appeared for Eugene, said as far as Lewis was concerned, Eugene and he were husband and wife. The reason she'd associated with Davis and Lee was that they had been making arrangements for their wedding, which took place on the 20th of September, and Mary Eugene was acting as matron of honour. On the 3rd of February 1954 in Sydney, as Dulcie Johnson, she was fined £20 for giving false information on a licence application regarding previous charges of drunkenness and other offences with motor vehicles from 1939 through to 1945 as Mary Eugene. She was disqualified from driving until July 1956. And an article relating to that on the 7th of February 1954 in the Sydney Truth. A lady of many aliases, Pretty Dulcie figured in a fleeting drama in the traffic court on Tuesday when police threw the book at her for having given false information when applying for a motor driver's licence. Cloaking her true identity under the name of Dulcie Johnson of Centennial Park, she had shown deplorable lapses of memory when she made her written application. She failed to acknowledge convictions of drunkenness under the name of Mary Eugene. She also omitted to disclose that she'd lost her licence twice, once for a period of 1 year in 1945 and for 3 years after convictions for driving under the influence. When quizzed about her false answer to a routine question, she was asked, "Have you ever had your licence suspended?" And she said, "I thought that meant if your licence was suspended at the present time." Pretty Dulcie's police record, which covered 3 single-spaced typewritten foolscap pages, identified her as the notorious Angel of Death. The record revealed she'd had convictions since 1931 in New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland and Western Australia for consorting, vagrancy, soliciting, assaulting police, brothel keeping and drunkenness. At 39, she's still smooth-faced and strikingly attractive. However, her hip was shattered by a bullet at her home in St Kilda in 1951. In 1954, she was in a relationship with Neil James Johnson, hence calling herself Dulcie Johnson in the court in February. On the 11th of January 1955 in Bondi, she was injured when she fell from the top floor of flats where she was living. She claimed she slipped and fell, but examiners believed her injuries were more likely from being pushed. Dulcie faced the Central Police Court for soliciting one final time in 1957 before retiring from prostitution. On the 1st of February 1959, Dulcie stood before a special federal court on a charge of not filing a tax return for 1957. It was claimed she earned £70 to £80 per week from the oldest profession. She was found guilty and fined £50 with £1 court costs for her slowness in paying the taxes owed. Her father, John Markham, died in Dunwich, Queensland in January 1963. Markham married Martin Rooney in 1972 in Sydney and gave up her criminal career to be with a law-abiding man. After this period, little more is known about Dulcie's life until her death in a house fire at her home in Bondi on the 20th of April 1976 at the age of 62. She was burnt to death in a fire which engulfed her Bondi bedroom after she'd been smoking in bed. Her death certificate had her name as Dulcie May Rooney. Dulcie had outlived most of her criminal contemporaries from Sydney's tempestuous Razor Gang era. Her funeral was held at St Patrick's Catholic Church in Bondi, and the eulogy was given by Detective Frank Bumper Farrell. In 2009, Markham was one of the figures from that era featured in an exhibition at Sydney's Justice and Police Museum entitled Femme Fatales, the Female Criminal. And Lee Straw has written a book titled Angel of Death, Dulcie Markham, Australia's Most Beautiful Bad Woman. Dulcie's sisters. Her first sibling was Florence Ena Parker, who was born on the 13th of July 1920 in Sydney. She was 6 years younger than Dulcie, and Florence's father has been either listed as Robert Scott or another family tree has her father's surname as Laidler. Florence married Herbert Albert George Pennington on the 14th of April 1937 in Sydney. They had 5 children together. On the 21st of June 1945 in the Sydney Daily Mirror, Herbert Pennington was charged with having bigamously married Florence Ena Markham at Darlinghurst in 1937, while he'd already been married to Agnes Halley Pennington. She then married Oliver Royal Gale, nicknamed Pommy, on the 8th of June 1946 in Surrey Hills. Florence was a waitress at the time of their marriage. Sometime between 1947 and 1950, she returned with 3 of their children to her first husband, Bert Pennington. He was working as a railway labourer at Sandy Hollow in New South Wales. Pommy Gale died on the 7th of February 1950 in Warren, New South Wales. His death notice in the Gilgandra Weekly says the death occurred at the Warren District Hospital of Mr. Roy Gale of Rooty Hill, Sydney, after a very short illness. The deceased was only 34 years of age and had been employed on Oxley Station for some weeks, where he took ill and was conveyed to Warren by the ambulance and admitted to hospital suffering a rare form of meningitis. The patient failed to respond to treatment, and his remains were conveyed to Rooty Hill for interment. In 1952, she married Percy Reeves in Warren, New South Wales. She listed her father as Claude John Markham, deceased, and mother Florence Margaret Parker, as well deceased. They had 2 children together, and Percy died in 1964. She then married Ronald Flanagan in Dubbo on the 15th of March 1969. Ronald died in 1978, and Florence died on the 26th of December 1986 in Dubbo, aged 66. Her next sister that was mentioned in the articles earlier is Millicent Elizabeth Markham. She was born 9 years after Dulcie on the 9th of May 1923 in Sydney. On the 24th of May 1936, when she was 13, she was in St Bridget's Orphanage in Ryde and absconded. She married Claude Neil Burrows, a bricklayer, on the 8th of April 1940 at the Fullerton Memorial Presbyterian Church in Sydney when she was 16. Claude enlisted in World War II 6 weeks after their marriage. He served in Egypt and the Middle East, and he was discharged in January 1944. It was a dishonourable discharge on account of his misconduct and discreditable service. They had a son together. On the 21st of September 1949 in the Broken Hill Barrier Minor, faked and stolen bank books charge fails. In Melbourne, faked and stolen bank passbooks. Passbooks figured in evidence during a General Sessions case in which Millicent Burrows, 24, of Faulkner Street, St Kilda, was acquitted on a charge of making perjured use of 2 stolen passbooks. It was alleged she used the books on the 30th of March 1946 to obtain the release of a Pentridge prisoner. She told the court that she was innocent but was afraid to name the man and woman responsible. She said the books were first a gift to her. She had then handed them to a man who gave them to another woman. I am not the woman who went to the jail, but I dare not mention the names of the man and woman now. The charge arose out of a visit by Jean Benson to Mr Corrigan MLA and JP, who was asked to go to the jail to arrange bail for the release of John Eade, then held on remand for trial on a housebreaking charge. Eade was released on a £300 surety, which the woman swore using a Commonwealth Savings Bank passbook showing a credit as proof. A few hours later, a senior warder detected some suspicious features in the passbook. It was discovered that the book was made of parts of 2 bank books stolen from the home of the parents of the real Jean Benson, now of Tasmania, in Watson Grove, Glen Huntly, in December 1945. Some pages from one book had been used inside the cover of another book. Mr Corrigan said he could not positively identify the accused woman as Jean Benson, who obtained Eade's release on bail, but they were alike. Senior warder Hector Deers said that the Jean Benson who went to the jail was like the woman in the dock, although the woman he saw at the jail had blonde hair and the accused was a brunette. The accused woman was also heavier. Senior Constable Donald Ritchie said that on the 30th of March 1946 he saw the man Eade before his arrest on the roof of a house at Neptune Street, St Kilda. Evidence was given that Ede was captured in Western Australia and convicted. When Millicent Burrows was arrested in Melbourne on the 8th of March this year, she admitted to Senior Constable Patterson that she had given the bank book to a man thinking she had done nothing wrong. She did not know they'd been stolen. Sounds eerily similar to her sister, don't you think? Millicent then married George Joseph Mackay on the 7th of July 1951 in the Methodist parsonage in St Kilda when she was 28. On the 23rd of October 1952 in the Sydney Daily Mirror, court told of hoaxer. Barrister Mr G. Quinn told the Central Court today that on the 21st of July, following a case in the Supreme Court, the homicide squad, uniformed police, a fire engine and an ambulance had been sent by a hoaxer to the home of his client, Mrs Anne Curtis, 33 of Liverpool Street in East Sydney. Mrs Curtis, Joseph Bede McLaurin, 32, Stanley Preston, 48, Francis O'Rourke, 34, Millicent Markham, 29, Greens Road, Paddington, William King of Pitt Street City and Joyce Clyde, 32, no address, were charged with having been found on the premises frequented by reputed thieves. Detective Stevens told Mr Quinn he knew that 3 shots had been fired through the window of Mrs Curtis's home after the arrest on the present charge, and in a 1952 Sydney Truth newspaper article describing prostitutes of Sydney, M. Markham, Millicent Markham, was featured with her photo, and it states that she had had 130 court appearances. Millicent died on the 27th of July 2011 in Sydney at the age of 88. So I hope you enjoyed the story of Dulcie Markham and her family. Certainly gives a really good idea when you're delving into the family tree of the links and how this seems to be a bit of a repeat going on between generations, for good or for bad.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.